Hi everyone, welcome to this podcast organised by Make Votes Matter. And it's an honour today to be speaking to Audrey Miller and Ella Eagle Davis about why Make Votes Matter is important to them and proportional representation. My name is Tim. I'm doing some work on podcasts because this is a big issue for me as well, how we can improve the voting system, make it more representative. And it's fair to say that Ella and Audrey are slightly different in age. So we wanted to get some different generational perspectives on why Make Votes Matter and proportional representation is important to them. So Audrey, do you want to introduce yourself first of all? Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, I'm Audrey Miller. At the moment, I'm living in York for family reasons, but originally I'm from the West Midlands. I'm now in my 80s. I've never ever had a fair vote, and that really is galling for me and for lots and lots of people across the country who have been disenfranchised for generations. And that's why I suppose I thought I've got to change this. I've got to change the world. I've been at it a long time, but Make Votes Matter was important for me because it's cross-party, it's cross the generations, and you get all races, faiths, and none involved in wanting a fair voting system.
Good stuff, and it's a very nice summary there. It's good to see that you've been so committed for so long. Sometimes I get a bit frustrated when you're up against it. Well done for all your commitments, and we'll come back to that later, Audrey. And Ella, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. Hi everyone, I'm Ella. I'm currently a master's student studying anthropology in London, but I'm originally from Gloucester. What drew me to the cause for electoral reform really was coming from a long line of women in my family who have always taught me the importance of making my voice known on important issues. And ever since I was a young girl, my mum has always taken me to, feminist events and marches and rallies, and really instilled in me that respect for activists and activism and the change it can bring. In the past few years, I've become increasingly sort of disillusioned with, apathetic towards the way our democratic system in the UK works. I've only ever voted twice, but both those times my vote didn't count. The candidate I voted for didn't get elected in the end. And so I've found activism in the form of Make Votes Matter a really fulfilling and amazing avenue to get the voices of young people, especially young women and young non-binary folk as well. Yeah, heard at a higher level.
Brilliant. Thanks for those introductions, folks. So, proportional representation, I always used to say, I'm a former teacher, I used to say to my students that if a party gets 20% of the vote, they get 20% of the seats in the National Assembly, which is representative of what people are intending. And first past the post is the idea that whoever gets the most votes wins in each constituency, and all those other votes are wasted. So often you have a majority not voting for the candidate that wins, or a lot of people who don't vote, and basically it's unrepresentative. And classically, people have always said the first past the post leads to stronger government. There's some evidence to suggest that that isn't true in the modern era. And first past the post, you have a government which is often elected, the current governments of the United Kingdom. You've got 30-something% of people voting for that party, and they have got 2/3 of the seats in the House of Commons, which isn't fair. It's like a rigged game. If children were playing a game like that, a board game like that, they would say, well, that's not fair, it's rigged. Why should I play in this game? And that's how I always kind of sum up PR versus that first past the post kind of system. So, Audrey, why is proportional representation rather and Make Votes Matter? Why are these really important issues for you? You've mentioned about not feeling heard in the past. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
I am passionate about this because I'm not a member of any political party, but I do have very strong ethical values which I want to see represented in Parliament. For example, I worked in Africa for a time, so I'm very passionate about the third world and development issues, human rights, persecution, those kind of ethical things. And when you're in a constituency and the candidates stand up and you make your points to them, often in the election period, they'll agree with you and say, yes, yes, yes. And then if you follow through, you see that they're not voting in the way that they said they were going to vote. And all they're doing is following their party whip. The whipping system is really a fundamental evil in my book, because it doesn't take account of anything in ethical terms. So that's really, as a non-party person, I want somebody in Parliament who will pick up ethical values and things that count, that really matter to the public. I think, for example, this one that's going through Parliament at the moment about dignity in dying is a good example. You don't need to have that value. It's not going to follow a party line. But it is important. And if you've experienced the death of a loved one in tragic circumstances, you know how important that issue is. And so I did admire the fact that it was put forward to Parliament without the whip. People can vote according to their conscience. And I think this is part of greater representation that we want to see in Parliament.
One thing that's quite curious about the UK is we do have party loyalty as valued much higher than in other European countries. And the whipping system, obviously there's different levels of whip, but basically the whip say you must vote this way, and you can lose the whip and you can be ostracised from the party if you don't follow the whip. And many people say that when you've got a minority party enforcing those kind of rules, that it's completely unrepresentative, and people should have the freedom to look at the issues. And under PR, if you say that you've received a mandate directly from the people and there's more parties, the whipping system has less influence. So I think they're very, very important points. Ella, so why is Make Votes Matter and proportional representation important to you?
Well, I think my approach to proportional representation and why it means so much to me is twofold. Firstly, I really value the idea of diversity and making sure all of our political institutions and organizations are accountable to intersectionality. And I think that comes primarily from starting my degree in anthropology, which is really concerned with the studies of societies and the way that people relate to each other. And of course, a big part of that is applied anthropology, which is all about looking at the inequalities and hierarchies within society. It's illuminated to a greater extent the barriers that there are to certain people getting into Parliament. Whenever I go to vote in an election, I take a look at the candidates on the list, and I don't really see anyone who's representative of me or any sort of part of my identity or my values. And that can be quite disheartening, and that's coming from someone who I recognize as relatively privileged. There's just so few disabled candidates, queer candidates, people of color in our parliament, and that to me is really shocking considering we're in 2024. So I really think proportional representation really will create that impetus to get more people from varied backgrounds into Parliament, and that can only ever be a good thing in terms of representation. And then secondly, I'm really interested in representation of young people in particular. That's the sort of research I'm doing currently for Make Votes Matter, is looking at how to get more young women into Parliament and how that can drive the gender equality agenda. But just young people in general, I think often underrepresented and underestimated in political circles. And that's something that doesn't just happen in sort of formal institutions like Parliament, but also in a variety of political organisations, NGOs. Young people are just seen as sort of apathetic, somewhat lazy, not really interested in the democratic institutions of our country. But what I see is as a generation of young people who have been failed continuously by the way that our system works and punishment it enacts on young voters. We have a very talented young researcher in MVM right now called Ruben, who's doing some research on the link between wasted votes and young people, looking at the proportion of young people in the constituencies that have the highest amount of wasted votes. And you can see there appears a real strong link between wasted votes and the number of young people, which I think goes to show just how unaccountable our politicians are to the voices and the needs of young people in this country. So I think proportional representation to me is a really good step forward in driving young people to get involved on the level of Parliament, but also make them feel like they are respected and heard at a local and national level in our elections.
Brilliant, and that's a very good point as well, because a lot of young people have this impression that, oh, my vote doesn't matter, doesn't change enough. We've got the cost of living crisis, the cost of tuition fees to go to university, the cost of rent, and getting on the property ladder for young people. It's widely considered that young people are going to be poorer than their parents for the first time in the UK for a long time. And PR, if every vote counts and every vote matters, people feel, well, this vote will make a difference and we need to all get voting and we all need to have our voices heard and to be represented at the heart of government. And I think that's such an important thing when you've got very, very isolated political centres, say in London and Westminster, not just geographically, but in terms of just listen to the voices when they're all screaming and shouting. You've got, largely males. Look at the cabinet, who tends to make up the cabinet. It tends to be people who've come from quite privileged backgrounds. And again, it might have changed a little bit with the new government, those kinds of figures. But to have a government that is representative and that is understanding and does respond to things, it also offsets things like populism and anti-politics, where people just think, oh, there's no point voting for anyone. Let's vote for someone who's going to really, shake things up. And often, they just make things worse. But I think they're very, very important points that you've both raised. So, Audrey, why is activism important to you? Because I think there'll be a lot of people who might have been a little bit active in the youth, and then when they get older, they think, oh, it's frustrating. You have all these added responsibilities, and you can feel that it's harder to change things. But you're a shining example of someone who, right through their life, has always been an activist. Why is activism important to you?
Well, I think it's purely selfish. Because when you're in touch with people who've got similar views, it actually feeds your enthusiasm and your passion, because you're not alone. You can actually pick up a phone, and if you've got something niggling, or you've been accosted by somebody and shouted down, you've got somebody you can talk it through. And so that's why I say it's selfish. I've always had that backup system. And one of the things that I was very involved with was a third world debt issue back, it was called Jubilee 2000, to cancel the debts in the year 2000. And that's a good example of lots of different groups. We called it a coalition. So there were hundreds of different charities and political parties, and we all came together with this single aim of cancelling the debt. And I think make votes matter because it's all party. That's feeding members of the different groups. It's a coalition. You can talk to somebody who you wouldn't agree with in any other issue, but on this thing about fair voting, gosh, you do agree. And you encourage each other, you feed each other, you learn from each other. And that greater degree of understanding, to me, I know it's really selfish, but I find the Zoom sessions, for example, because I can no longer get out and stand on the streets or join marches and things. But now, even in my 80s, I can enter a discussion and I can learn something from young people. I mean, Ella's just mentioned Rubens. Listen to one of his contributions. and it was inspiring. So that's really why it's a purely selfish point of view, I know. In terms of the greater good for society and for our civilization, I think the individual cogs in the wheel, we can contribute, we can all help.
Yeah, and I think that's very important to acknowledge that it can be quite lonely at times and people can feel quite alienated and atomised. And joining organisations which accord with your values, it helps you feel that you're making a positive contribution. And then, of course, when more people join together, we're more likely to see change happen. So again, very, very well summarised. Ella, activism. I know you've hinted at this in terms of some of the research you've done in terms of intersectionality and getting young people to vote, but why is it important to you?
I guess what Audrey said really is a part of it is really selfish reasons. In that, as you mentioned before, being a young person nowadays is extremely hard. With the cost of living crisis, rising rent, just rising prices of everything really, can create like this really sort of negative bubble where it's very, very hard to get out of. And I find activism is very much sort of a light at the end of the tunnel, in that it promises a group of people in which you can, you find a sense of community and a sense of camaraderie as well. So for me personally, it has really great benefits just for my own sort of mental well-being. But in a wider sense, I think activism it feels almost like a duty to me, especially when I recognize that I have the incredible luck and opportunity to go to university and study at a higher level than undergraduate as well. And the knowledge that you gain from that, to me, it would seem incredibly selfish just to sort of hoard that all to yourself. And I think it's the duty of academics to go out and apply what they've learned and share that knowledge with organizations like Make Votes Matter, creating research and new data to help push forward incredibly important issues of our time, which I think proportional representation and electoral reform really is. So I see it as part of a duty, I guess, as someone who's really interested in research. But I also think that activism is just so synonymous with youth culture nowadays as well. And people tend to argue that with the rise of social media and TikTok and Instagram and these sort of things, that we see this new kind of slacktivism emerging where young people are sort of just pressing buttons and likes and sending things. And it doesn't really is not really an engaging form of protest. But I've always thought that was a very silly idea. And the idea that just because young people are migrating online doesn't mean that they're not out there making their voices known. I think activism is so synonymous with the way that young people think about themselves, the way they act, the way they listen to music, the way they gather together, and it's become a really integral part of our language as well. And that's again sort of an inherited legacy from generations before us, sort of carrying on the fight, but in new forms. So yeah, I just think it's so ingrained in everything that I wish to do, and what I think a lot of young people wish to do, which is change the world around them in better ways, but in new ways. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that togetherness, when you're in a group that accords with your values and you work together, it's soothing just to think that there's people out there who who want to change things. As much as you sometimes see the negativity in the world, I think particularly with social media, it's often it almost attempts to discourage you, doesn't it, to do anything. Social media with some of the toxicity, but I think coming together, working together, I think that's very, very important. And there are fine traditions of that. And if you think about some of the huge, huge things that have happened in the past, and look at the groups and the people who came together to change those things, I think it's as important as ever, particularly with, I think, some of the worrying trends that we see around us at the moment, such as this kind of climate change, or, maybe it's a hoax, these kinds of conspiracy theories. I think it's as important as ever to make sure that good messages are heard from individuals and groups and getting it out there, particularly to do with making voting systems fairer and also making them less likely to be corrupted. I think if you can take advantage and work on little groups to swing elections, etc., it's not very democratic. And if we make every vote matter, it's much harder for vested interests to kind of control the narratives, as it were. Thank you very much for all your comments. Is there anything else, Audrey, that you want to add before we finish?
Well, I think I should stand up for the oldies. I agree with what Ella was saying about the young people and so on, and I feel guilt-stricken that I had free education and all the rest of it. I'm living far too long and taking too much out the system. But, you know, the older generation are often dismissed as not being tech savvy.
Yeah.
And actually, if they're given encouragement and help by your generation, and if you can actually give us a bit of help, we'll be even more effective. And it's one of the joys for me is actually, I can say it because she's not here, but meeting Molly was really inspirational for me. And she's been such a conduit for and guided me through the technology and helped me make my voice more effective in Make Votes Matter. So please, can I put that plea in for the oldies to be given a bit of help and TLC? Because we have got some experience, could be useful to this campaign.
No, I agree entirely. The sort of we need that intergenerational solidarity, I think. And I think a lot of what political discourse does nowadays tends to divide. And young people have this preconception of older generations as sort of out to get them and sort of standing in opposites in terms of values. And I really think that we as young people need to recognize that we came from somewhere, and this is like an intergenerational legacy that we're part of. And we have a duty as well to listen to older activists and gain their sort of wisdom and insight. Definitely. I agree 100%.
Brilliant.
But I think if you did a podcast on that, Tim, and stress that it's not just the political parties that need to come together, it's to make votes matter. We've all got to work. We've got to broaden this coalition as wide as we possibly can. And that's why citizens' assemblies and every conduit you can find to bring people together is what we need.
Definitely. Ella, anything else you want to add?
I guess just that for anyone listening, really, just the importance of getting involved. And I've talked to a lot of young people in sort of gathering testimonies for them as part of our new youth wing of Make Votes Matter. The general trend, the general narrative seems to be that people want to get involved. They're quite desperate to, and they see that there are avenues that they can get involved, but they just lack that drive. And it's like there's some form of an emotional barrier there that's preventing them from getting involved. And I think at least I attribute that to the fact that most, not just young people, but a lot of people in this country are sort of beaten down and considered they don't think they're knowledgeable enough or intelligent enough or they don't have enough experience to get involved in politics. And I think Make Votes Matter is the sort of organization where everyone has a place. Everyone can do a little bit of something. And there's some fantastic people working there who, as Audrey said, will help you, guide you into the organization and then guide you in terms of getting you up to date with what's happening and the tools that we can use to spread the word on electoral reform. So I will always stress to everyone, and especially young people, that organizations like Make Votes Matter seem scary, but they're not. They're incredibly welcoming communities, and they desperately want young people involved. So just reach out, look at our social media, look at our website, and see how you can get involved.
Brilliant. Good way to finish. So Audrey and Ella, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for sharing your ideas, your passion, why you think PR and Make Votes Matter is important, and also the importance of working together and trying to change things. So very important messages. Have a great day.